Welcome to the Transatlantic Debrief. I'm Samuel Dempsey, and this episode may look a little bit different, and that's because it is. I filmed this inside of the belly of the beast, per se, in the heart of Orbán's think tank here in Brussels, the MCC Brussels. Before I say anything else, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to the MCC for opening their doors to me, allowing me to use their production equipment, and for giving me unedited access to our conversation. Thank you. That said, this was an odd one, tense at times. MCC Brussels is the most well-funded think tank in Brussels now, and its money flows from MCC Hungary, Orbán's think tank, which is seeded with 1 billion euros in assets by the Orbán government. A former MCC fellow told The Guardian that students were expected to, quote, propagate Orbán's positions, and then were offered lucrative positions at MCC-affiliated institutions. In the course of my research, some genuinely crazy things came up. Some came up in the conversation, others did not. Things like, for example, an MCC staffer and fellow also trains CCP officers in China, or that the Heritage Foundation, the infamous far-right think tank in Washington, D.C., behind Project 2025, is deeply financially connected with the events and projects of MCC Brussels. This conversation is long, an hour, unedited, uncut. I wanted to put everything in front of you and let you be the judge. A lot of people who have watched this already told me that I was too soft. Maybe I could agree with that. But to MCC, I was too harsh. I leave that to you to decide. Here's my conversation with Jacob Reynolds, the head of policy at MCC Brussels.
So it's a pleasure to speak with you today. We're in MCC Brussels, and when this building was opened in 2022, Viktor Orbán's political director announced, quote, "It is our goal for Hungary to become an intellectual powerhouse." The role that MCC plays is a really unique one. It is an influential force in Brussels. That was the intention, but now I think many would say it could be the most influential force. But there, of course, is detractors to this. So the Corporate Europe Observatory, the EU's leading lobbying watchdog, calls MCC Brussels, quote, a far-right think tank spreading Orbán regime's propaganda. And the resource coordinator said that the think tank here is, quote, able to host events with messaging that would have been considered authoritarian, discriminatory, and unacceptable some years ago. I want to understand the vision, the mission here of what you're doing. So in your own words, what is the mission of MCC Brussels?
Yeah, we were set up and we started here because our job was to shake up the Brussels intellectual scene, which had become very cozy, very samey, and that certain questions which were on the lips of ordinary people across Europe, questions about migration, questions about climate, questions about gender ideology. Yeah. All of those things were on the lips of normal, ordinary people right across Europe, but nobody in Brussels was talking about them. Or if they were only talking about them to, like the gentleman you quoted from the Corporate Europe Observatory, would to say that these are unacceptable, authoritarian, far-right, fantastical ideas that nobody should be allowed to discuss. Yeah. So our job was to come here, shake things up, wake people up from their kind of intellectual stupor and present an alternative.
And so what is the alternative that you want to present? I mean, you've definitely shaken things up. I think your presence here is unavoidable. Everyone knows now that these are conversations that have to be had. So where do you want the conversations to kind of lead to?
Firstly, in a more sovereigntist direction. So we're supporters of sovereign nation states, and we believe that in most, if not every area, the too much power has gone to centralized, unaccountable institutions. We want things to go in a freer sense. So especially when it comes to speech, the kind of hallmark of the European Union for a long time has been and we've done a lot of work on this about the control of speech, especially online, but also physically. We ourselves have been subject to various campaigns to try and not allow us to hold meetings, etc. So we believe things should be freer. We should have more conversations about more things. And then there are a certain kind of core set of, you might call, civilizational values that we think need to be defended and held to, whether that's issues related to the family, whether that's the teaching of history, whether that's how people see their national past. Like, there's a kind of cluster of issues that we call civilizational ones about whether the European nations have a sense of self-confidence that we want to defend.
And so I really want to dive into that policy, how that translates these different things you oppose, because I think a lot of political movements, and right now you guys are kind of at the forefront of this political shift that we're seeing take place in Europe at the moment. And political movements, as they start, are always very clear about what they oppose. And as you talked about here, there's the free speech, there's the bureaucratic overreach. You know, Brussels has basically moved beyond its mandate. But beyond what you're opposing, center of power you're looking to kind of object against, what I want to understand and reconstruct is kind of what you want to build in its place. You know, the center of power is moving. You guys are making the headway that you've aimed for, and everyone else is kind of just scrambling around trying to figure out what to do in response to that. But when that happens, when the shift happens, you guys have a majority of political control, maybe in the EP, the commission reflects more of the values you're talking about. You have national capitals that reflect that as well. Who's governing what? I mean, what happens when you have transnational issues, problems across borders, financial crisis, pandemic, the war on the continent? How do things actually get resolved in that moment?
First, I'd say that as much as we appreciate it, you might be slightly optimistic about our chances, because we recognize that the kind of sovereigntist movement, the patriotic political movement faces tremendous challenges, and it's going to take a long while for these things to work themselves out, even if in certain countries things might happen quite quickly, and the populist moment is liable to produce political earthquakes over and over. So I think this is very much a longer term project. But in terms of where things are going, the first step is obviously for us that matters that are to do with nation states have to be returned to nation states, and a tremendous amount of power has to be kind of renegotiated and brought back home. And what that's going to look like is therefore necessarily going to look different in different countries. And so there's and there shouldn't be a one size fits all policy with regards to what's good for France or what's good for Poland. And this era is going to be, as we've already seen, is going to be characterized by a lot more complexity, some would say messiness, about how it is that these different countries work out their national interests. Yeah. One of the problems that we face in the contemporary moment is that for a long time, nobody's had to have a conversation about what is your national interest. So all of these issues have been discussed exclusively at the level of the European Union, the supranational level. And so people are kind of quite out of practice when it comes to discussing things in terms of national interest. And that's going to take a lot of intellectual work. One of the things that we've identified quite consistently is that lots of patriotic, conservative political movements are actually quite weak when it comes to deciding what it is that they stand for, what are the things that they really want to return to. And part of that is, as I say, because they're unpracticed, and part of that is because over the last few decades there's been a kind of core weakness at the heart of lots of these intellectual weakness at the heart of these movements, which hopefully is beginning to change slightly.
So what is the role of Europe then? If national interest becomes the core focus, things return to the national capitals, does Europe have a position to play? I really think what I'm asking and I want to understand is, what does the world look like to MCC? Because right now we're in a moment where everyone is saying, there's a rupture happening. Mark Carney, a speech at Davos. You have great power competition. You have spheres of influence that are being talked about from the US, from Russia. Where does Europe fit in that? Does Europe have a role? Is it nation states that are kind of ad hoc responding? Or I think the other spectrum of the policy that people are pushing for now is a federalized, a stronger EU that is able to be a great power itself. So where does Europe find itself not vulnerable and able to project its own role into the world in this model that you're talking about?
Yeah, the first thing to insist is that there's a distinction between the EU and Europe, and that the EU doesn't have exclusive monopoly on the concept of Europe. And that was one of the things that was actually also quite strong in the Brexit referendum among many Brexiteers, a movement I knew very well, is to say that just because we're leaving the EU, for example, doesn't mean that we no longer consider ourselves European. So first you have a distinction between the EU and Europe. But the second thing to say is that what has been the dominant response so far, I think, is just simply unsustainable, which is to say that, well, because we need to act together in certain ways with regards to certain issues, therefore the only model that's available is the European Union, and therefore the European Union has to work in an increasingly centralized way, in an increasingly authoritarian way with regards to the interests of its member states. And so the fundamental point is that nobody really is allowed to test out the alternative position, which will emerge in its own course in its own period of time, which is that it's something based on states deciding on the basis of the national interest. And
it's basically it's malleable. It's not yet fully envisioned what is the alternative to the European Union that you would want to project a role in the world. It's kind of bring the power back, focus on that initial win to have national states hold more power, and then see what they want to do based off of their elected leaders at that moment.
Yeah, sure. What's clear is that the current model doesn't work, and that the European leaders can keep pretending that it allows Europe to act decisively and like effectively on the world stage, but it doesn't.
Yeah, you don't need to convince me on that.
Yeah.
I see it. We all see it. Yeah.
And even they would admit this. And so the two options on the table are more centralization, which seems to me to just exacerbate all of the issues that people already recognize exist, and potentially prompt quite serious splits if you were to centralize power over the heads, or centralize even more power over the heads of ordinary people across Europe. That, seems to me, would provoke the kind of reaction that they're most worried about. Or we have to go through a period of renegotiation where nation states of Europe come together and renegotiate what it is that they want to cooperate on, what that they don't, and where they might have differences of opinion. And so for certain countries, certain things might make sense at moments that don't. But it's clear at the moment that what is happening can't go on. And so we have to explore an alternative.
And so it's a really an intra-border focus of the issues taking place within the bureaucracy, within the mold that Brussels currently occupies. Looking beyond the borders, are there threats that you see as legitimate threats to the interests of national interests that you're talking about here? I mean, or what are the considerations abroad, basically, that need to be taken into the equation here?
Yeah, all of the familiar ones are still the issues that animate people. So the Europe, insofar as you can talk about it as a political entity, and the European Union, but most importantly, all of the nation states of Europe, find themselves at kind of historically a low point, a weak point. We would say, in large part, because of the policies pursued by the European Union.
Yeah.
And so we find ourselves at a low ebb. People talk about Europe's century of humiliation just beginning. And so that means we're weak, by definition, and weak almost with regards to everybody. So you can look at obvious things like Russia, China, people now talk about America, even countries like Turkey playing like a more assertive role with regards to their interests. So everywhere you look, you've got challenges to the European nation states. And I think everybody recognizes that these are serious challenges. The development of the kind of Russian war economy in the context of the war in Ukraine is a huge concern, especially to lots of countries on the east of Europe. The subservient role that Europe has with regards to the United States, and especially the United States, which is now much more open about defending its own interests. All these things should worry everyone. And the question on people's lips should be, how on earth are we supposed to respond to this? We would say that the responses so far formulated by the centralizing and centralized processes of the European Union haven't worked, but also that they can't work.
All right, let's come back real quick to the role of the MCC more specifically. So do you think it's fair to say that the MCC predominantly represents the views of the Hungarian government and taking into consideration the open sponsorship by Viktor Orbán?
Certainly for those of us in Brussels, I don't think that is a fair characterization. I think that lots of us are here because we've recognized something exciting or intellectually interesting about the broader work that the MCC does. And MCC Brussels having a separate legal and institutional personality. But there's one thing that you can say that we do agree on, which is that there's a relentless focus on the Hungarian national interest by the Hungarian government, and that you can disagree with any particular policy choice that Viktor Orbán and his government make, but you can rarely make a case that it's not done out of a consideration what's best for Hungary.
Okay.
And that's a model which doesn't have a repeatable set of answers right across Europe, because what's in Hungary's interest might not be in France's interest, might not be in Poland's interest, etc. But those of us who work at MCC Brussels think that that's an enduring basis for European cooperation, is deciding what our national interest is. And there'll be things where we applaud the Hungarian government for their kind of single-minded focus on the Hungarian national interest, whilst then going to a conversation and supporting the efforts of, say, French friends in our political orbit who will disagree with that.
So it's not a coalition of ideological interests as a unifying factor, but just the core interest of representing back home is kind of what you're saying here, and that's what MCC is embodying. Because you also mentioned it before we kind of get to that, is that MCC here in Brussels, you said, is not the case necessarily, but MCC in Hungary, you would say, then is more representative of Hungarian interests with the Orbán government at the moment.
Well, the MCC in Hungary, and the work that it does in Hungary, is predominantly focused about teaching, or what is called in Hungary talent development.
Yeah.
So the role is to provide intellectual formation for hopefully patriotic Hungarians, and they do an amazing job at doing that, and that's their core focus. And insofar, and they put out a lot of intellectual substance that goes on there also at both the central headquarters in Budapest, but also all of the regional centres. And that obviously has a thought leadership component for them. And so they're putting out a vision of the world that is very distinctively Hungarian. And that's why they attract so much interesting intellectual and political talent from right across Europe, who are all, if you speak to someone and if they know that I work at MCC Brussels, one of their first questions will often be, or they'll be looking for me to say, right, that there's a possibility we can go and be involved intellectually in Hungary, because it's such a vibrant intellectual space for, you might say, dissident and not so dissident intellectuals. So sure, they're unapologetically Hungarian, as they should be. And in many ways, we're unapologetically Hungarian too, in the sense that we believe in that kind of core mission of fundamental national interest. Although most of us, the vast majority of us here in Brussels that work for MCC Brussels are not Hungarian.
Sure. So I kind of want to focus on that academic mission that you described, that is really something that takes place in the MCC in Hungary, because, you know, there is contentious debate over the free exchange of ideas in Hungary and the influence of foreign actors. It's a very long-running story, of course, and I kind of like to plug in some context for listeners, and then we can work from that. So Hungary under Orbán consolidated around 500 news outlets under a single political conglomerate, and that dropped, of course, the press freedom index within Hungary from 40 to 68. At the same time, we saw, you know, the Central European University was considered the US accredited academic focus of influence in Budapest. And then that was then pushed out because the Orbán government basically didn't want to work on signing that agreement and putting it forward, despite the compliance of a CEU to put it forward. The EU court, of course, later said that this legislation was illegal, but by that point, CEU already moved to Vienna. So almost at the exact same time, MCC started to take its own mold there in Hungary. So what is the theory of academic freedom and plurality of views coming from MCC here and representing this vision that you talk about that is in the Hungarian interest when, you know, we see that model kind of taking form with MCC and with Hungary as a whole?
Yeah, so as far as I understand, the strategic rationale for MCC in Hungary is that national movements and conservative movements and patriotic political movements should be unafraid of having centers of excellence where they can cohere intellectual thought and develop ideas and have a place where they can test them out.
Yeah.
And one of the things that historically the right across Europe and also America, in part because it's slightly libertarian bent or kind of hostility or suspicion to the role of government, has been very weak on defending the institutions that make up society and that make the kind of genesis of intellectual life possible. So the conservative political sphere has always had this uneasy relationship with state institutions and has largely avoided kind of putting its interests out in the open. And we see the results of this in lots of countries right across Europe, where major institutions that you would have thought of as being, if not conservative in ideological orientation, conservative in their kind of basic instincts. I think of like museums and schools, which are supposed to transmit knowledge, are supposed to have this like relationship to history. And conservatives have been completely asleep when it comes to what's going on in these institutions across Europe and America and indeed elsewhere.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's been quite ideologically innovative about what the Hungarian government has done, and what now conservatives right across Europe and America are realizing they need to do as well, is being more forthright in defending institutions and creating institutions of their own.
Sure.
And that's, I think, the intellectual kind of political context in which the MCC exists, is that we can't just let the institutions drift, or be, as some might say, taken over by those who are ideologically hostile to us. And instead, we should think about what kind of institutions we should found and how we defend the ones that exist. And that's I think, the kind of context in which MCC exists.
Trying to prevent the institutions being taken over, I mean, does that mean those institutions that are seen as not following into that conservative tradition should be pushed out? Or, I mean, where is the balance of letting these ideas develop for themselves in a really equal footing kind of way? Yeah,
well, I think that the key test that has to be applied, and by the way, I had no idea whether this represents the position of the Hungarian government, but for me, the philosophically interesting point is, how do you keep institutions true to their role and mission and function? And so if you have something like a museum, which it should exist to transmit and preserve the legacy that's entrusted to it, whether it's a national museum and a national legacy, or whether it's a specialist museum and has a specialist collection, it's relatively straightforward to me that the mission of that institution should be about preserving and educating people about that legacy that's been entrusted to it. And so if you have a moment where, for whatever reason, and we can go into the ideological and kind of political history of these things, but if you have a situation where suddenly the people running these institutions like a museum, people working in such a museum, are completely hostile to the legacy. They think that the legacy that's been entrusted to them is racist, it's colonialist, it needs to be constantly apologized for, it should be moved out of sight. Maybe the kind of treasures in these museums should be sent elsewhere. That, it seems to me, you don't need to be ideological or political about it. You just say, these people no longer represent the mission of this museum. And it should be well within the remit of government to say, actually, if you guys aren't going to do the mission that was entrusted to you, then we will find other people who will. Okay. And so that's the point at which preserving the institutions becomes a politically kind of necessary task.
I want to come back to this kind of movement as a whole, because it is taking, you talk about this being a return to sovereign ideals and reclaiming control of these institutions that have overreached. But the political movement that you're a part of and that MCC is a part of here is transnational itself, as you've talked about. You representing the fringes to a certain point. You've talked about the Americans. And that transnational movement is really tied to this global elite, really. And we see this with the Heritage Foundation, for example, which of course are the architects behind Trump's policy at large, but definitely with foreign policy. And the Trump administration has been explicitly interventionist with Europe. And that, I think, is an interesting thing to kind of look at and understand your views on it. I mean, because we have a administration that now is saying they want to have State Department grants that support certain political parties or political think tanks in Europe. We, of course, have Greenland as well, something that is kind of an ongoing debacle. The question is, what is the correct amount of American involvement in European affairs, or any kind of, I suppose, foreign great power in European affairs? Is it acceptable now because it's the Trump administration that is conservatively aligned, and unacceptable then if Newsom or AOC, comes to power in the next election? What is the ideal role for U.S. involvement here?
Yeah, the first thing to say is that American involvement in Europe is obviously nothing new. You don't have to take obvious examples like the Second World War or something, but even in more recent political history, Europe has been the playground for all kinds of left-leaning foundations, institutions, government itself through USAID, as we well know. So America has played an incredibly active role on the European continent, and to a large extent has played, in most recent political history, has played a kind of surreptitious, slight hidden role. So it's preferred to advance its aims through the semi-secretive funding of foundations and the exchange of political operatives between the various...
Just trying to understand better for listeners, what are you specifically talking about here, like mechanistically? Are we talking about the U.S. government kind of doing this, or are you talking about Soros, or like, what exactly? Because I think that's a very interesting thing to open up a little bit of, like, what has been the model that the U.S. has done that you think is not the right model and that is actually the acceptable one going forward?
Well, but I mean, it's a mix. So you've got, obviously, and people will know through the kind of Doge revelations about the role of USAID or USAID. And so there's a kind of governmental component to the influence that America's exercised on Europe. And then there's, of course, private foundations. You mentioned Soros, the whole number of them, the Marshall Fund, all these organizations have been very active. And in many cases, they were set up with noble aims and ambitions, and then, like some of these other institutions we talked about, in my opinion, might have drifted from some of their core purpose. But broadly, the sense, I think, has been well identified in the United States of a left liberal state nexus of like-minded people, broadly part of the same political parties, or at least within the kind of same political tent, like that. Or that kind of cozy relationship that existed between politicians, foundations, the government, exercised an enormous amount of soft power, as it's called, on the European continent. And that some of that stuff only come to light. Some people knew it more extensively because of work that they would have done to expose this. But that's like that happened behind closed doors through the funding of foundations, through the funding of think tanks, and all the rest of it. And that. Whether that model has completely come to an end is an open question. But now what we see that's, I think, slightly different about the approach that the second Trump administration's taken is that, in my opinion, they've just been more open. They've been more at the public level. So if they have a set of policy ambitions that they want to achieve with Europe, they now go and just speak to, you might say, berate or attack European politicians for doing or not doing them. So JD Vance will come and say, you guys don't believe in free speech anymore, this is a disaster. Marco Rubio will say, we've got a civilizational problem here and we're worried that the Europe that we used to know is no longer the Europe that we that we see before us right now, and are you guys interested in changing that? And lots of people don't like this message. Lots of people in Europe, as it happens, don't even recognize this message. I think it's just insanity. But what's undeniable is that it's now said out in the open into people's faces. And that, I think, is whether you agree with America or disagree with America. And on many of these things, it won't be a surprise to anyone to know that I agree with lots of these things. But it's out in the open. And then you come on to the question of influence through funding and what happens when this steps into a kind of what some people are already calling a kind of right-wing version of USAID. And I think this is a really interesting question, and one that European patriots and conservatives should actually be quite wary of, although there'll be lots of people who, given how starved of funds the European conservative scene is, will be understandably interested in seeing what they can get from the Americans. But I think generally people should be a little bit wary, as you always should be when it comes to money, and we should be aware that part of the salience that this has, or the power that America might be able to exercise through the giving of grants, whatever, is because of our own weakness, again, that there doesn't exist this kind of support for conservative political movements in the EU or European context. And so we 100% we should be wary, concerned. I trust most of the patriotic political organizations I meet to make good decisions. You can take someone's money and not be compromised by it. And this, as long as this stuff happens out in the open, I think is fine.
Okay. I think it's really interesting, the vision that you paint as to the role that the U.S. has had, specifically as being this kind of vassal for these liberal interests, because, I mean, it sounds like a very powerful instrument and institutional apparatus there, which, I've worked in the State Department, I've seen, I've worked in the U.S. Congress, I've worked for the Democratic Party, I've seen kind of the ins and out of this establishment. I think it's funny to me a little bit because for me, it's the opposite, in the sense that they can't work together themselves on anything, Like, I think that, we have a CPAC, for example. Conservatives are like, we're conservative, we come together. We don't really have that transnationally for the liberal side of things. And at the, governmental, institutional side of things, historically, the foreign policy apparatuses of the U.S. government have been, quite centrist to conservative. Being in the State Department, for example, the old slogan was pale, male, Yale. If you wanted to end up at the State Department, you had this very Kissinger-esque kind of narrative through. It's an interesting vision to see it being this empowered liberal mechanism pushing forward its ideals. I have not seen that. I'd love to hear if there's a specific thing you can point to, because you talked about USAID, for example, and I know that, of course, there has been democracy promotion things, mostly, in the fall of the Soviet Union, to kind of make sure that transition could unfold. And I would think those are things that are not necessarily liberal or conservative ideals, but, to make sure that, like you're saying, everyone's interest and their freedom of thought can be respected. So what are the things that you see as being emblematic or demonstrating that kind of system that you talk about in its influence?
Firstly, I'll just note this kind of funny that we obviously have this mutual incomprehension with regards to the left and the right, because all of my friends on the political right will constantly complain that, we're so fragmented, the left always moves as one, they always defend their own, whereas we're always stuck in these inter-senile disputes and we can never agree. So it's kind of interesting. We obviously, both sides of the divide think of the other as a more unified bloc than maybe they are. So that's funny to me. Part of the story you have to tell to understand the way the American influence across the world has kind of changed or transformed is a somewhat similar one to the story I've told about most other institutions like the museums or the schools and the universities, which is that you have, the post-war moment and the founding of lots of these, whether they're institutions like the Marshall Fund or elements of the state that slowly grow up to as you say, that were steeped in the idea of democracy promotion, building the basis of liberal societies, defending what were considered kind of characteristically American or Western freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, these kind of things. And so lots of these organizations grow out of that context. And also the hard power element of it, that America, in the Cold War context, needing to keep the Western European and indeed the West in kind of one coherent bloc to face down the threat posed by the Soviet Union. And lots of these things have this rich and in many ways kind of respectable, fully endorsable, supportable history, intellectual and political history. And then something kind of begins to change, and you notice this, and it's still very much the case certainly here in the European Union, but you notice that something begins to change because there's like a definitional shift in terms of how people understand what the work of, say, if we take as a theme, democracy promotion. Democracy promotion used to be about promoting democratic processes, which used to mean, are the elections free and fair? Can people vote regularly? Has somebody cancelled an election, et cetera, et cetera? And that was, if you like, in philosophical terms, a thin conception of democracy. Democracy is about going and voting and making sure people leave office when they're voted out, et cetera, and that there isn't someone at the ballot box kind of standing over you, making sure you vote in a particular way. And then, especially through the 1990s, although the intellectual origins of this go on for a while, but into the 2000s, these institutions get reconceived and they have what they would call a kind of thicker conception of democracy. And democracy now includes, do you respect minority rights? Do you have adequate sexual education in your schools? Is like abortion available? So,
and real quick, what's the alternative to that? What is the democracy you want that doesn't have to respect minority rights or the things you just mentioned there? I mean, what alternative would you like to see there that you think is more democratic, and how would that be more democratic?
Well, let me just finish the intellectual history and then we'll come to it.
Right.
I apologize if it bores you, but
no, it's the opposite actually. There's each sentence you say, I want to understand a little bit further what you're talking about, because there's a lot to unpack here, and I think it's easy for things to get a little lost in it.
Basically, what I'm trying to indicate is that the role of these institutions became broad, and you can agree with the role becoming broader, or you can disagree with it. You can say it's fantastic that there's now a concern about minority rights baked to the heart of these institutions, or you can say, actually, that's not my cup of tea. I'm not so interested in that, and I want something that's right. But I think it's undeniable that that the focus did become broader, whether you agree with it or disagree with it.
Sure.
And the point is that they didn't stop getting broad. And so a concern for minority rights, which in the mid-20th century meant, is it illegal to be homosexual? Are people prosecuted if they beat up a gay person in the street? Do black people have equal opportunities? Is there segregation? Is there things which are, to me, the bread and butter of minority rights, which I would 100% defend? And that then slowly gets expanded as well, or the definition of it becomes...
And that shift is, I mean, largely academics talk about this being a negative freedom, where basically everyone has the innate right, as you're saying, don't go assault and harass a black person in the street, that's illegal, you can't do that. But it doesn't necessarily have the positive freedom, which the positive freedom is then enabling the actual quality of life and the ability to pursue things to be on equal footing. So how do you see that? What is the role of government in making sure all are free? Because in the free market, negative freedom, you can have, like we saw in the Barron era, a complete consolidation of power, certain, minority groups, certain groups in general, whatever they may be in different factions, economically, racially, whatever, can have more power and then use that power to wield it over and abuse others that they see as contrary to their own interests. So what's your relationship that you see as being the way forward for positive and negative power in that?
Yeah,
positive freedom.
As some think of it more, something resembling a classical liberal, although not on everything. Like for me, the most important non-negotiables are those negative freedoms. But then you can't ignore the existence of economic inequality and equality. Some conception of equality of opportunities is at the heart of all of these ideas too, and is at the heart of the notion of the American dream too, which in the American context. But so you can't have rampant inequality. Corporate power in many respects should be treated as skeptically as governmental or institutional power. In the EU context, we see this because there's a nexus of corporate and state power when it comes to the policing of speech. So the Digital Services Act, for example, specifically mobilizes big tech and big government to advance the kind of what I call the speech oppression aims of the Digital Services Act. So you've got to be concerned about government power, you've got to be concerned about concentrations of corporate power as well.
So what would be the MCC Digital Services Act? What would we see as being the model? Because is it that there should just be no regulation, or is there a model of regulation that you think is better served to protect those online, but also not limit their freedoms that they should have?
Yeah, well, the MCC Digital Services Act would be repeal the Digital Services Act in its entirety. That would be the MCC Brussels position on the Digital Services Act. And to a large extent, although I can't speak for every single EU country, but most countries have had their own kinds of regulations which have worked with varying degrees of success at enforcing kind of basic standards. But the important thing and the important fundamental principle you'd have to check is, are we talking about applying the norms that exist in the offline world to the online world, which is broadly basically like, we already have laws for harassment, for example. You can't follow people in the street incessantly or people get restraining order, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. Or are we talking about something different? For example, the EU has recently just launched a cyberbullying program where it wants to protect people from cyberbullying. And I can tell you, if you go and look at what they think cyberbullying is, it doesn't really look at much like bullying, let alone much like harassment. Right? It's a very, very nebulous category that involves even people being criticized for their political positions. Right?
Interesting.
So the question is, the fundamental kind of conceptual question at the heart of designing digital regulation should be, are we talking about enforcing laws that already exist? Or are we talking about widening the scope of existing laws and enforcing new ones just because it's online? And generally speaking, all the digital regulation pursued by the European Union and lots of member states and even non-member states like the UK has been that second category, has been expanding the definitions of harm, of vulnerability, of harassment, all of it has been expanding definitions and applying new laws. That's the fundamental flaw at the heart of all of the digital regulation that we'd like to see undone.
So would you like to see a European model that's more similar to the American model of regulation that doesn't have these kind of, because obviously it's a looser, more, maybe as you'd put it, free model?
It'd be enormous. I mean, if we had something like a digital First Amendment, would be an enormous step in the right direction. I don't think it's by any means the kind of be-all and end-all, or that the job is therefore then done. It would be a step forward. People would be freer than they are now, which would be important, but it wouldn't be the end of it. We know, and to come back to your point about corporate power, there's an interesting series of questions here, because we know, at least if you're a patriotic, conservative type of person, you would say in the era of social media before Elon Musk bought X, or bought Twitter and turned it into X, you would have said you didn't feel particularly free online, and yet there was no, right? And yet it wasn't the government.
I mean, that's a very interesting perspective. What made it less free, do you think, before? I mean, maybe let's talk, because I think oftentimes the things that are pointed to there is that to broadening the scope, like you're talking about, of hate speech, for example. Where are the limits to what you think is classified as hate speech and should be seen as unacceptable or acceptable? Maybe?
Yeah, when it comes to private companies, you are immediately in a whole realm of things, because on one level you want to say, if you want to set up a social media site that is like blue sky and that absolutely nothing controversial is allowed on there, like, more power to you. I think few people are going to actually be interested in such a social media platform, but fine. So at one level, let's avoid being too prescriptive and saying that it should be made illegal to have what I would consider a mad definition of hate speech on your social media company. But you still recognize that there's a social problem. If the dominant social media platform, or at least the dominant platform for political discussion like X, doesn't allow very much political discussion, or its bounds are kind of policed too much. So you'd at least have to recognize there's a social problem there, even if there isn't an easy kind of legal remedy for that problem. But I mean, to take it specifically onto hate speech, I mean, personally, as a personal philosophical position, I don't believe there is such a thing as hate speech.
Interesting.
Like, if you look into the philosophical literature and the political literature about what constitutes hate speech, I think it's a complete mess. Nobody's ever been able to define what the hate speech is supposed to be. And you can, of course, say there are things that are hateful, but the idea of a category of speech which is by definition harmful because it's hateful is, I think, to be honest, like a kind of philosophical fiction. It doesn't exist. You can't demonstrate that there's harm just by virtue of being hate.
So if, let's say, there was a website that algorithmically boosted anti-Semitic content and had people, putting out slurs, using the swastika, maybe Holocaust denial on a platform, that would not pose hate speech. You're saying that wouldn't exist in that premise. That would just be something that's uncomfortable for Jews to have to experience and go through.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I wouldn't personally use I wouldn't want to use such a platform, or do what I can to maybe encourage people to adopt a different mode of self-regulation in that case. But generally speaking, I mean, the test is not whether it's bad, nasty, unacceptable, uncomfortable, all the rest of it. The question is, should anybody have power to do anything about it? And so your fictional social media company, I know lots of people on the left would say actually is Elon Musk X in the contemporary age.
I think I'm putting it a little bit further, but I will, we do know, of course, that Grok has Grok, by nature of the way it was coded, had a lot of anti-Semitic things that I did talk about at different points. Yeah. We do see algorithmically that there's a boosting amongst the neo-Nazi community, of course, on X. So, I mean, I'm not fully saying, but I mean, it is a picture to be painted there, but I just kind of want to grapple and wrap my head around, because I think the main thing is that hate speech is something that there's one community now that's vulnerable to it, but in the end, we all could be vulnerable at different points to hate speech. And so when we as a community are being targeted, I mean, let's say with Christians, if I'm a Christian, I'm an Episcopalian myself, if all of a sudden Episcopalians are the target of a hate campaign backed by corporate interests or something, I would hope that there's, legal mechanisms that the government has to protect me for that, right? Because, I mean, it's more than uncomfortable. That could be a complete societal inhibiting to my freedoms, my ability to walk outside or exist online amongst my peers, So, I mean, I want to kind of understand what's the ideal, scenario there, because it's an evolving, especially in the digital space, it's something that is moving light years beyond what we can envision. So it's something we kind of have to look into the intricacies of, maybe.
Yeah, well, I would say that I could agree with lots of what you said, but the point about you expecting there to be legal remedies is where I'd draw the line. So I don't think that you should have legal remedies just because people post content on an online platform that you find distressing or uncomfortable or hateful.
What do you think those people do not online? That's also the question. I mean, if they're online, because I think most of us spend most of our day-to-day lives online. That is kind of, in some sense, more of the world. I mean, especially my generation. I don't know exactly what you are, but I'm Gen Z, and I think on average we spend like 6 to 8 hours a day online to some capacity. Yeah. It's insane. That has a lot more impact on who we are as individuals and what we're able to do and how we're able to build out our jobs. A lot of things are online as well in that. So, I mean, what should be the consequence? Is it societal isolation, or, I mean, is there any sort of correlation between who people are online and what they do in the real world? Or is it truly the online is the Wild West, do whatever you want? In the real world, no, you can't say that thing. You can't go up and harass or say something rude that's anti-Semitic, or the N-word to a black person, something like that. Is there a real distinction between the online world and the physical world?
I would defend the idea that we do need spaces where people can say whatever they like, even if those things might be hateful. And I think for a lot of people, although as far as I know, there's not like a great academic literature on this topic, but anecdotally, and from people who've done more anecdotal studies, there is like a fair cleavage between how people behave online and how people behave offline, and the remedies are available are slightly different, but many of them are kind of the same. So if you're if you're out on the street and somebody yells something at you that you dislike, you can either confront them or you can walk away.
Sometimes.
And the same, and if you can't walk away, that begins to become, if they're threatening, that begins to become a police matter, right? To the degree that they're threatening. And the same rule would apply online, right? If you believe that there's a relevant kind of equivalence between being made to feel threatened, uncomfortable, like genuinely fearing for your personal safety, then you can go to the police about that, and the fact that it's online doesn't change anything. You should still be able to go to the police.
What is I'm harping on this maybe a little bit longer than the rest of the plan or you would like to, but it's just interesting to me because what is the fear of recognizing hate speech? I mean, because you're saying you don't see it as having the consequence, you can walk away or whatever, but it just sounds kind of like a dark society. Like, if I'm gonna be honest, like if I am in a world where I walk outside and I can hear people, just launch slurs at will, they're unable to do that. And as we've seen in history, up until, as you said, the mid-20th century, that was how it was for large portions of society. Entire communities were dealing with daily oppression in a very overt way like that. It's a bleak world to live in. I mean, is that what we want to be acceptable or okay, or?
Yeah, well, the point is that social problems require social solutions rather than legal or institutional solutions. So
did we see that? And just to understand, how did we get out of the 20th century you described earlier, in the mid-20th century, where we had these types of negative freedoms that you said had to be adapted? I mean, they were legal solutions, right, that were able to bring us into this more modern and developed civil world.
Well, this is an interesting bit of political theory, because I would say no, there weren't legal solutions, there were political solutions, right? People argued for one, convinced some section of society, some kind of weight of society, and as a result of that, as a result of a political settlement, laws were passed, institutions were changed, etc., etc. So the job is a political one. You've got to have debates, you've got to argue with people, you've got to convince them, you're right. You wouldn't want to live in a society where you walk out the door and everyone's spewing nasty stuff non-stop. And similarly, you would want to have an online world where you can experience things in a kind of similar way. And most, generally speaking, like lots of the platforms have all these different tools that they can offer you to personalize your experience, and you can allow people to comment you or not, and you can have a more closed down experience and a locked account, or you can have a more public one, depending on how you view the world out there. And all those things are fine, and different social media platforms should come to different have different tolerances for these kind of things, so people can choose where they feel kind of most comfortable. But the question about hate speech has always been the development of a category that was expressly designed to link the notion of hate with harm. And that's where I draw the line. I don't think you can create those two things, especially because the background context for these things has always been the idea of the harm principle, John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which is that the state can get involved in your life, and in the case of speech, can get involved in your life to the degree that you suffer harm. And the the philosophical innovation of the concept of hate speech was to say that hate constitutes harm and therefore the government can get involved. And it's that three-step bit that I resist about the concept of hate speech. It doesn't mean that you don't recognize that there is hateful words out there, that there is hateful content, that the people are hateful. That you don't have to ignore the fact that this exists in order to resist the conceptual innovation of hate speech.
Yeah. It's a very interesting perspective, and so it seems like you're saying there's no place for it. You don't support or want any of the hate to be in anything that you're advocating or working for in this, but it's not going to be something that you're going to push for these, like you're saying, to jump to have it be a legalistic or more governmental role in it.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So to bring it back, I want to give a chain of facts, and you tell me where it starts to break down. So the MCC Brussels operated here for over 2 years without disclosing its funding. There's an active EU investigation as to whether this breaches lobbying rules. And when the filing did happen, we see that there's a 6.3 million euro budget that comes almost entirely from MCC Hungary. What we do know is that MCC Hungary has a stake in MOL, which is Hungary's national oil company, and roughly 65% of MOL's oil comes from Russia. So the institution that you work within is materially connected to Russian energy revenues. So as we've discussed, sovereignty is central to what you're trying to do and what MCC Brussels is trying to do here. If there's this wanting to work against an external entanglement as a principle, and you want that to apply to Brussels, how do we not have that same perspective here in MCC Brussels? I mean, you mentioned before that you can have, these different interests behind things, but it doesn't have to be compromising of your work. Is that the situation here? That's the theory that you've come to that makes sense? And if so, I'd love to understand how you got there.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say to anyone who's interested in what our views are is that and the intellectual genesis of our views. You can watch our podcast, you can read our reports, you can look at us on social media, and I hope it's very clear as to why it is we take the positions that we do. And if there's anything unclear, we'd love like a conversation like this, you can come and ask us, right? So as all the, as you call them, the chain of facts, relatively long chain to take us back to Russia, but nonetheless...
not too long. Direct funding from MCC Hungary to MCC Brussels within a stake in the oil company, which, has investment within Russian oil. It was a little more direct, honestly, it was a little more direct than I anticipated. And so I think it's an interesting thing to kind of try to needle through.
Yeah, well, as I say, our views are quite open and obvious, and the reason we take those views is open and obvious because we never stop explaining them, and we have nothing to hide in that sense. Like as you say, what's there is a matter of the public record, and the elements that we've had to disclose as part of taking on work in the European Parliament and being subject to the transparency register, were like fully complied with all of the various regulations that they had. So yeah, you can say that. The point is, what do we stand for? We stand for the things that are written in our reports and published on our website and our social media. And
so that chain has no impact on the policy recommendations that you put forward, or
I'd like someone to make a case that it is, right? Or the burden of proof can be on them.
I mean, I think one thing that would be is that Hungary is one of the main countries that's advocating consistently against the sanctions on Russian energy and is blocking these initiatives that are coming out of the European Union. And that has also been something that has been recommended by MCC Brussels here. So I think that would be the primary case of impact that people would put forward. Do you not see that to be the case yourself?
Well, Hungary has a national interest in what is deeply linked in its dependence on its need for energy, and lots of that energy comes from Russia. As it happens, so does energy from right across Europe. And there's a tremendous hypocrisy that characterizes this issue, where Hungary is often singled out as being the bad boys for continuing to buy Russian natural resources. The only difference is Hungary does it openly through pipelines, whereas everybody else uses rebadged Russian natural resources from elsewhere. So there's a tremendous hypocrisy on this issue.
I agree with that. And I think that part of that hypocrisy exists, though, because there is the top-down will. And I'd love your take on this, actually, as well, that I've seen that you are a staunch supporter of Ukraine, and you believe that Russia has to lose this war. But the way that Russia is able to fight this war is because of its energy revenues in large part. It's the war economy that's propping it up. And so by nature of understanding that, and the European leaders within the institutions right now recognizing, they make the top-down decision, okay, we don't want Russian energy anymore. We want to move away. As we see, for example, let's take LNG from the United States. That's the primary pivot that we're seeing, which is, replacing one dependency for another. I have issues with it, but I understand in the moment, it makes some sense. But as you talk about, there's this whole network of sanctions evasions that then unfolds. And I think that is less so to do with the lack of political will or the hypocrisy, but it's simply an implementation question. I mean, as you've talked about, Europe is weak in this regard. They don't have the capacity to actually check everything and make sure these sanctions are being verified. And historically, the role of doing that was on the United States. That was the Biden administration had a huge role in making sure they have the capacity, boots on the ground in every single country to basically check those things. So Europe was relying on information. Now Trump, doesn't have the same interest that he once had to do that. There's the political will that's there, but there's a breakdown in the implementation of it. Whereas what Hungary is doing is the political will is not there. And you yourself, and I've seen from MCC Brussels, do believe in the political will to support Ukraine. So how do those two visions relate or complement each other or just coexist kind of in that way?
Well, firstly, I mean, MCC Brussels, as far as I'm aware, has no political position on supporting Ukraine.
None at all.
I have some personal views.
Yeah.
As sovereigntists, we deplore the invasion of a country and the violation of borders, right? That's a given. But and I have my personal views, which whatever. I'd take issue with something quite fundamental in what you said, because I think that you can talk about the political will being there to move away from Russian energy.
Yeah.
The fact is that there's a kind of political cluelessness involved in trying to do that or saying that can happen, and that the persistence of what are essentially Russian imports just coming in different ways into Europe reflects not an implementation problem, but a structural economic problem, which is that Europe cannot do without these resources. It can try to, and like in countries like Germany, you can drive some large proportion of your industry to bankruptcy by trying to move away from Russian natural resources and replace them with other ones, and at the same time, or almost at the same time, moving away from nuclear power or whatever. But it reflects a structural energy weakness in Europe. It's a structural problem, not a question of implementation.
There's a limited amount of fossil fuels, basically, that Europe has, right? So that's the structural weakness.
And you can't just, and no amount of, and that's why, to some degree, I mean, some people might even say that the implementation has been deliberately leaky because there's only a degree to which, and it's not 100%, only a degree to which Europe can move away from its reliance on Russian energy, because energy was not taken seriously as a fundamental political category in Europe for a long period of time. And indeed, the European Union's energy policies made it such that Europe became less and less secure in energy. The energy policies which promoted the shutting down of nuclear power, energy policies which refused the development of local sources of hydrocarbons, et cetera, and just generally a kind of hostility to the idea of energy as a political category, like as a good thing. And so all of these energy policies and the European Union's energy policies were fundamentally driven by the assumption that we should produce less, consume less, do less, be less.
Yes,
right?
I blame Merkel. I agree.
Yeah,
we saw that. Yeah.
And so, I would say this is a structural political problem. Hungary's refused to do, and whether it be able to, who knows, but Hungary refused to do what Germany did, which is basically say, we're going to sacrifice X% of our industry, even though nobody ever said this, and it would have certainly been rejected to the German people if anyone had got a chance to have a say in this. They said, at the cost of what I would call a political virtue signal, we're going to destroy our economy.
But so you think structurally the transition can't ever happen? It's not like, in this immediate moment it's challenging, but like ever the dependency has to persist.
Well, I don't know about ever, but as I say, there are plenty of European countries that could, and even Germany, right, has been digging up coal again. So there are plenty of European countries that could look to their own hydrocarbons, develop alternative sources, develop nuclear power, whatever, over a period of time, right, for sure. It's not beyond the wit of man and it ought to be, or at least to be able to move things to such a degree that the dependence on Russian energy is not so kind of stark and damaging as it has been.
I think the dominant understanding of the case for that transition can happen basically cold turkey at the moment is that you have the long-term investment in clean energy that would give Europe the comparative advantage because, like you said, it doesn't have the fossil fuels that other major great powers have, and at the same time then move to American fossil fuels and use that basically as the stimulant to get through the moment to have the long-term clean energy transition.
Well, as long as, firstly, nuclear is part of your picture of clean energy.
Yes.
And secondly, as long as it involves pushing back on lots of what comes with the kind of the clean energy, what I call the kind of greenest ideology, or the clean energy kind of ideology, because a lot of that has been quite explicit about, firstly, not making sense on its own terms, so moving towards forms of renewables that are very intermittent, that require a huge dispatchable capacity alongside them, that would just result in you running two energy systems at the same time. So firstly, it's been a bet on the wrong kinds of clean energy, in many cases, most renewables, and also a refusal to change the way that electricity is generated, transmitted, stored, et cetera, alongside that. So it's people who advocate clean energy transition are, largely speaking, the people that are responsible for the energy mess that we got ourselves into. It's not that we're trying to move to that kind of place. It's these people that are responsible for the mess we're in.
So I want to close with the fact that you're a scholar of Hannah Arendt, and she was a Jewish woman who fled Nazi Germany, who spent her life warning that fascism grows when truth becomes debatable. And one of her foremost warnings was that autocracy grows when the language of liberty becomes captured by those who seek its own demise. So how does your background as a scholar of her work and inform what you do here? Because, I'll just, from my perspective, but when I see the consolidation of press freedoms in Hungary, when I see the CEU expulsion, a replacement independence, when I see that the framework that is underpinning behind what MCC Brussels is doing here, I find myself wondering, what would she be thinking? What is her framework? How does it apply to these secret events that we've talked about over this conversation?
Hannah Arendt, who was been the kind of intellectual love of my life, was I think at heart in her own particular way, was at heart a Democrat. At heart believed in the power of ordinary people to transform the world, and that the power of politics, of people engaging in the political process, of having their voice heard, of being able to act on the world politically.
Yeah.
And that space is fundamentally that political space is fundamentally the space that is swallowed up and denied by the current institutional form of the European Union. The European Union looks, in almost every one of its policy documents or every one of its proposals, looks at ordinary people as a problem, as a source of problems. It says that whether we're destroying the planet, committing hate speech to each other, whatever, that ordinary people are the problem, and the role of politics is to manage, control, direct ordinary people in the way that's determined to be the best by those at the top. That's the fundamental opposite to the underlying philosophical conception of the person that Hannah Arendt has. And so I see the kind of authoritarianism of our times not lying in those examples that you might give, or your characterization of what it's like to live in Hungary, but instead in the evacuation of politics and its removal to a supranational level, something that ordinary people have no touch, that ordinary people can't touch.
Yeah.
And the spirit that animated Hannah Arendt, the spirit that she saw at play in the 1956 revolution in Hungary, that of people taking control of their destiny, of resisting an authoritarian, overweening, oppressive power that was characterized by massive state bureaucracy, a disregard for personal freedoms, etc., etc. That spirit, to me, seems much more alive in the populist movement of today with regards to its approach to the European Union than in any number of liberals who use a couple of quotes of Hannah Arendt, or left liberals use a couple of quotes of Hannah Arendt to bash Donald Trump.
Well, I think we both can agree that the power is always with the people. So it's been a pleasure to speak with you here, Jacob.
No, thank you very much.
And thanks for hosting again here in MCC Brussels.
No, pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Transatlantic Debrief. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share to your friends, coworkers, and community. This episode, the intention for it was to dive into what is the growing phenomenon of the far right in Europe. These individuals are coming to power, and very soon they could occupy a majority decision-making grouping within the European Parliament. They could be guiding the values and the trajectory of the European Commission. So with all of that in mind, I want to understand the policy framework to which they're pushing forward. I don't feel like that was fulfilled from this conversation. What I learned from this conversation is that what the MCC and Jacob Reynolds are good at is building a narrative. They're marketers. They're telling a story that works. It's populism at its core, at its finest, at its most compelling. But it felt strategically hollow. But I want to have these conversations because we need to know what the world looks like when they're in power. Because right now, for those where they do occupy power, the world looks chaotic. So if someone watching this is from that side of the sovereigntist, what I would call far right spectrum, and believe they have a policy framework for which is actually suited to meet the needs of this world today? Please, let's talk about it. My email, as always, analysis@samuel-dempsey.com. Thanks again, and looking forward to seeing you at the next episode.